Good evening. Well, if you're on SAPA Channel 8 and you're in Springfield, and ideally lots of other places, then you know we have come upon another episode of Book Talk. This episode I have with me Derrick Belanger, and Brian Belanger. And we are basically going to be talking a little bit about one of our literary heroes, H.P. Lovecraft, and of course the brothers' current projects. So, Derrick, you go first. A little bit of background, and tell us what you do and why you're here.
Basically, I've got an anthology coming out, a collection of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stories called A Study in Terror. The project I put together basically because Arthur Conan Doyle is basically just known for his Sherlock Holmes stories, but he has all this other very rich, influential material most people ignore, or just they don't know much about it. And so I put together a 2-volume anthology showcasing it with essays from experts and scholars explaining the importance of this work. One of the first parts showcases Doyle's weird fiction, which ties quite well in with Lovecraft, who was at least partially influenced by Doyle's writings. And unfortunately, most people don't include Doyle in the weird fiction canon. So that's one of the reasons that I was excited to be on this show and to talk about Lovecraft, as well as a little bit about Doyle's weird fiction as well.
Brian, tell us about your part in all this.
Well, I'm a freelance illustrator, and so I am illustrating both of the covers for this anthology, and I contributed a piece as well. And again, it's just the fact that Derrick and I are such big fans of this type of classic turn-of-the-century literature that I was very excited for the project, especially when I started reading everything and I realized, I was like, oh my goodness, this is fantastic work. So that's my part in all of this, and I'm just hoping it leads to more illustration work.
Well, let's expand a little bit about Lovecraft, who is, a lot of people know the name.
Right.
But and maybe they've seen some of those god-awful movies that have been made.
Yeah, sure.
But tell us a little bit about Lovecraft's fiction itself. Exactly what did Lovecraft do that was so groundbreaking?
Do you want to start on that one?
He scared the hell out of us.
Lovecraft's fascinating because most people just know him for what we call the Cthulhu mythos, but he also did his dream cycle literature as well as other short stories that are just very good standalone pieces of fiction. Probably what's most groundbreaking for Lovecraft would be his cosmicism or his cosmic type stories, where he really emphasized his belief that not only are we, we're alone in the universe, and if there are higher beings, they don't care about us. And so the mankind dealing with that concept that, there's no, very atheistic belief, but yet there are these higher creatures, but they're just, in the end, it might, in the Call of Cthulhu, it appears that they might be gods, but by Mountain of Madness and further writings, it's very clear they're not. They're aliens, and we just don't have a concept for understanding them. And it's that horror of knowing that mankind is insignificant that really drives home, I think, Lovecraft's fiction.
Yeah. And I mean, this is coming out, most of his work was in the 1920s and early 30s, and it's coming out of, after World War I, and it's where, for like a generation about that time, 1 or 2 generations, you've had the theory of evolution firmly entrenched in people now. So it's really this very bleak sense of, it's the horror of insignificance. It's like not something like Dracula where it's a very personal one-on-one. It's the horror of, you don't care, we don't care about you, we don't care about humanity, all of life is meaningless. And he tells it in a way that it really expands on the Gothic flavor of Edgar Allan Poe. Right.
And he doesn't use any of the standard narrative devices either. That's one of the things that always struck me about Lovecraft. Is he'll always take one character's point of view And you don't see any dialogue, for instance. It's
Right.
all description.
Sure.
Yeah, and and he seems to be writing right from the gut.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And growing up in New England, and being here, I mean, one of the parts that's so strong is how grounded it is. His writing is in this area.
Oh, yes.
You can
Yeah.
see New England throughout everything. Even if Dunwich doesn't exist, it exists. I mean,
Yeah.
we see
Right.
it everywhere. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, it's living in New England is like living in a Lovecraft novel. It's almost like Disneyland. You can go down to Providence and visit his graves. You can visit the locations of places he wrote about. Here in Vermont, the story "The Whisper in Darkness," he names very specific locations that you can still visit that are still there today.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. A lot of people don't know that Lovecraft spent a great deal of time in Windham County. The Whisper in Darkness, I believe that's set in Townsend, Vermont.
Yes.
And I know we know that Lovecraft was in Dummerston, Vermont.
Okay.
In fact, I went to a conference there about 8 years ago, which was held specifically in Dummerston.
Right.
Unfortunately, one of my friends, I have a friend who goes to all these things, and every time he goes to one of these Lovecraft conferences, somebody dies, and that's what happened again.
Oh, no kidding.
I want to write a story about
Conferences, huh? There you go.
Robert
Oh
Bloch
my
was
God.
Robert Bloch was one. And I think that happened at least 2 or 3 times.
Wow.
That's why Robert. Oh.
Well, now
Yeah,
we
so
know.
so that's why I'm not going to any conferences with him.
Smart move.
But Lovecraft had strong ties to Vermont, and he loved the landscape up here. He really captured the darkness underneath all the foliage and sunshine.
Right. Absolutely.
Right.
And I mean, Whisper in Darkness is such a classic story, very good, and it tied right into that flood that happened in Vermont.
Yeah, the 27 flood.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so whenever I would think, floods around here happen again, it's a great story to read, just to relive, to see how close he was in connecting that experience. Where I'm from in Colorado, we just had massive floods last year, and I couldn't help but read that story again, go back up to Lyons, Colorado, which the way his describes the flood affecting the town is very similar. I didn't see any giant claw creatures, unfortunately, but it was worth looking.
Yeah.
No, the claw creatures are in Lake Champlain. I thought everybody.
With Champ?
That's right.
Funny thing, I don't believe in lake monsters. I don't think anybody does. I don't. These things never eat. They never
Sure,
reproduce. They
right.
don't excrete. There's never a skeleton. You're going to have people will try to have us believe that something could live in the lake for 3,000 years and never be seen by a camera. I mean, come on.
So what are you trying to say?
Well, sure, and that would be a very Lovecraftian belief. That's a very rationalist
Right.
belief. But yet he did write about the Migo living in the caves of Vermont and for very long periods of time. And he makes it work because that's the power of fiction. You can do that.
Yeah. Well, it's just that the intensity of the whole thing, I really think, is the key to Lovecraft's fiction.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's great about Lovecraft is he did not live a long life. I believe he died when he was 47, 46
Something
years old.
like that, yeah.
Like that.
Right.
But you still have a very strong progression and development of an author where the early stuff is very much, you can point, like, okay, he's doing Lord Dunsany here. In the story of the Hound, that's the one that some people argue was influenced by the Hound of the Baskervilles, for example, and in some of the Doyle writings.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt. Well, Lovecraft himself said his childhood hero was Sherlock Holmes.
Right,
And
sure. And he did attempt to write some mysteries. I guess they weren't very good. He never published them.
No, but I've got a paper on this that I published somewhere, comparing passages of Conan Doyle's weird fiction with passages from Lovecraft, and challenge the audience to identify the correct
Oh,
quote.
nice.
And it's 50-50.
Sure.
Half of them
Really?
get it, and half of them don't.
Oh, I bet.
So wait a minute. So because one other thing about Lovecraft though is the way he writes. No other author uses words like eldritch or gibbous.
Right.
So you're saying Doyle used these as well?
He certainly did. I mean, Doyle had a huge vocabulary.
Right.
Oh, that's true.
Yes.
And when you've got that, that's one of the reasons I write fiction myself, just so I can use my vocabulary.
Right. I agree.
You know, you can't use big words on Facebook. Nobody knows.
Right.
But anyway, Conan Doyle, whenever he was when he was writing strange fiction, Yeah, that's when a lot of those words would come out, and he certainly had a strong sense of the dramatic.
Right. Definitely, though, when talking about the narrative, I do think Lovecraft's approach to writing was very unique. And I think that kind of you're blending that pulp kind of fiction, more which at the time, even some of Doyle's like Lot 249 kind of fit into that kind of mold. But with the Dunsany, very descriptive, very no dialogue kind of work, and you combine those together, you get a very unique voice. He did, and obviously Arthur Machen was a big influence on Lovecraft as well, and Blackwood. But, you have all those influences, every writer does.
Yes.
But he definitely had his own unique voice, and as it progressed over time, you have that huge shift with the Call of Cthulhu. I think that's the story where suddenly his unique voice emerged. And it's such a strange story because the narrative it's like levels and levels, and you have one section about people who dream.
Yeah.
Everyone's suddenly having this weird dream, and then the next section you have the weird thing in the swamp, and they arrest all the swamp people, and then suddenly you get to the actual story, and you have this giant, Rilliah, and Cthulhu comes out, and I don't think anything was written like that before, and I think you can make an argument nothing really has been written well like that since. It's a very strong piece of fiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very, getting something original in horror fiction is really rare now.
Yes.
I know people who argue that Oscar Wilde was the last original one with the Portrait of Dorian Gray.
Well, I've never heard that before. That's interesting.
Well, think about it. Nobody's had something quite like that before or since.
Right.
And we make the references to it all the time. I would think of like, I don't know if you watch ABC News, but every time I see Diane Sawyer, I have to wonder what her portrait looks like.
What she got hidden in that attic?
She hasn't physically changed at all in 30 years.
Right. Go into her attic.
Yeah, exactly.
Find the portrait. Wow. Right. Well, I think you can make a very strong argument that Call of Cthulhu is a unique piece. I don't think there's anything else like that. And then it really changed. Then you get to, and in that story, you feel like, there's these strange demigods that once ruled the earth. But then you get to Mountains of Madness, and he shifts again, where, lo and behold, it's not that Cthulhu was a demigod. He was an alien. He came to Earth, and there was this big war of these highly intelligent alien creatures during the times of the dinosaurs. And he mentions everything about the changes in Earth's past that ties in. Again, it just grounds in that reality. He's a very learned man, and he tied his knowledge in with his writing.
But see, I never took the either-or approach to it. I always thought it was a case of like, well, they're gods, and they're aliens, and there are other things that we can't know about. It's just part of the mystery of his work.
Well, right. I would still say that they would to go in the cosmos, the idea of cosmicism, that they are pretty much aliens. That the God thing is just that's how cultures understand things. Like that was how in the past we'd understand. The sunrise every day, it's this God in the sky thing. But now we understand what it really is, and that it would have been a natural progression to get there.
Right.
That would be my take on it.
Okay. Well, anyone who's ever read a Marvel comic will tell you there can be a god and an alien and the devourer of worlds.
So let's take the illustrator's take on this. When you read a Lovecraft story or one of Conan Doyle's weird stories, or any story really, what does it look like in your mind? Do you ever picture drawing it?
Oh yeah, lots of shading, lots of blacks and dark tones, and just swashes. I remember one of the strongest early impressions reading Lovecraft was when we camped on Camp Seguin in Maine, which if you've ever been there, it's right on the coast of Maine, and it's not a beach, it's rocks and tidal pools and crabs and eldritch phantasms and so forth. And that is not a place for a sixth grader to be reading this story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, for the first time at midnight. And I can hear the waves pounding against the shore. And I can see it in my head. It's like, oh, I'm doomed. But yeah, in my mind, I see images very clearly. It's like, okay, now I can see just things rising up out of the water and so forth. And that's part of the joy of being an illustrator or any artist, is trying to capture what's in your head and seeing how close you get. And I think most artists will say that you really don't.
Yeah.
You only get a fraction of it. I'm sure writers will say that.
Oh yeah. But
Yeah.
I dabble in pastiche.
Yeah.
So I'm writing in Arthur Conan Doyle's voice, or trying to.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that is extremely difficult to do because it's not my voice.
Right.
Right.
Right, and I think, you know, some tried, like Derrick did try to write in Lovecraft's voice. I don't think he was very successful. And some, you know, there's been different things. I actually think with the Cthulhu Mythos, as they expanded over time, when people kept their own unique voice
Yeah.
and just used the Lovecraft creatures, I think you had a few stories that were more successful. A really interesting blending of the two voices of Doyle and Lovecraft would be A Study in Emerald by Neil Gaiman. I don't know if
Right.
you're familiar with that particular story.
No, but of course I know Gaiman.
You're right. It's an excellent piece where the old ones have taken over London, and just talking, and Holmes, never called Holmes, and that's kind of a twist towards the end, is investigating a murder of an old one. And so, and it's a very
Right.
interesting piece, but that's a very good example of blending the two voices and actually making it work. One of the things that I think is interesting getting to like voice with Lovecraft too is interpretations with film, they've all failed. You know, I don't really think, except for maybe that Silent Call of Cthulhu film, I think that was quite good.
Oh, the silent thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought
Yeah,
that
I saw.
was,
Oh yeah, that was actually produced down the river here.
yeah, and that one I think was actually pretty good. I think segments of Whisper in Darkness were good. I think they kind of got off track about halfway through that film. But for the most part, I think it's tough to take his stories and adapt them to the screen. And I think, as you
Right.
said, part of it was that unique narrative with not a lot of dialogue.
Yeah.
A lot of very strong description.
Right, so they all get distilled into standard horror formulas that we're used to seeing.
Right.
Right.
And when they try to fit them in, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, at all.
Right.
Really, you need you need a surrealist to do it properly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would have been curious was that a few years back, Del Toro was supposed to make a big multi-zillion-dollar version of At the Mountains of Madness, which I think, with someone who's a big fan of Mac and Lovecraft, maybe that one could have worked. And I kind of wish we could have seen it.
Yeah.
But that just didn't end up happening for various reasons.
I always